Welcome to today's explainer. You know, have you ever stood out on a beach, watched a surfer glide just flawlessly across a breaking wave, and thought to yourself, wow, that looks exactly like human consciousness? Well, probably not. But today, we're going to explore a truly fascinating framework from author Dan Weber. He uses the actual mechanics of surfing to map out the complex neurochemistry and philosophy of the human mind. Honestly, it's just a really brilliant way to visualize how our brains process reality.
Okay, let's dive into this. What exactly does riding a wave have to do with your brain chemistry? It sounds like a massive leap, right? But Weber proposes that the mind operates exactly like a breaking wave. Throughout this explainer, we're going to unpack how the dynamic tension in our brains, and specifically, we're going to focus heavily on the absolutely crucial relationship between dopamine and serotonin, dictates how we respond to the entire world around us. We're going to look at the brain not as some static, rigid computer, but as a fluid, totally dynamic environment.
Right. So to really understand this metaphor, we first have to define the environment of the mind. We call this optic flow. Our most basic cognitive function is just figuring out how to situate ourselves in space and time. So optic flow is basically the constant merging of spatial relations, meaning where things are, and temporal relations, meaning when things are happening. Just like a wave is constantly transforming as it moves over a static seabed, our immediate surroundings are constantly transforming our own perception. Weber breaks our reality down into two competing forces. We've got the spatial paradigm, which represents the static reef, and the temporal paradigm, which represents the moving water. If you have way too much of the spatial paradigm, you become hyper-aware of your physical boundaries. You actually start to see yourself merely as an object. But on the flip side, if you have too much of the temporal paradigm, you become completely oblivious to your physical circumstances. For real psychological stability, we need the perfect balance between the two. It's just like a wave needing the exact right blend of reef depth and water flow to create the optimal shape for surfing.
Moving on to part one, the chemistry, tide and board.
Let's start with the tide, which in this framework represents serotonin, the neurotransmitter deeply associated with patience. Think about how a low tide operates out in the ocean. When the tide is low, the water hits the abrupt incline of the reef, causing the wave to jack up suddenly and violently. Weber argues this is exactly what happens in our brains when we have low levels of serotonin. We experience hypersensitivity, and we have these sudden overreactions. But healthy serotonin? That acts like a high tide rolling over a gradual incline. It slows things down, promoting the patience we need to let our memories surface and actually properly shape our current experience. And on the flip side, we have dopamine. Where serotonin is that slow, patient tide, dopamine is the surfboard itself. Dopamine promotes action. It triggers the immediate impulse to pursue a reward. Just like the specific design and shape of a surfboard dictates how sharply and actively a surfer can change direction on a wave, dopamine drives our active pursuit and our immediate responsiveness to the world around us. It is literally the engine of our forward momentum.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core neurochemical tension that governs our everyday lives. Serotonin is all about timing and patience, while dopamine is all about pursuit and action. Their interaction determines exactly when and how we respond to risks and rewards. If you only have dopamine driving you, you might act way too quickly and risk injury, basically the equivalent of nosediving your surfboard. But if you only have serotonin, you might wait too long and completely miss the reward altogether. The interplay between these two chemicals is the encoding of our reaction times, and it helps us perform perfectly in the constantly changing surf of daily life.
That brings us to part two, the ride, hemispheres and frequencies. Just as the surfboard and the wave interact in the water, so do the hemispheres of your brain. The left hemisphere acts a lot like the surfboard. It processes information in a sequential, linear, and ultimately subordinate way. The right hemisphere, though, acts like the wave itself. It processes information in a global, dominant style full of a multiplicity of complex curves. The path of the surfboard, the left brain, is always derived from and subordinate to the massive, living complexity of the wave, which is the right brain. Let's actually break down a surfing maneuver to see how this works in practice. A standard maneuver has two phases. First, there's the penetration phase, where the board actively cuts into the water. This directly mirrors the brain state of concentration, which is highly spatial and very active. Then you have the release phase, where the board rotates out and is just carried by the wave. This mirrors contemplation, which is passive, temporal, and guided by the natural flow of the environment rather than the ego of the rider. And the crazy thing is, this isn't just some clever metaphor. It maps directly onto literal brainwaves. When you're in the penetration phase, when you're actively concentrating, your brain produces high-frequency rhythms. When you enter the release phase, when you're contemplating,
your brain shifts and produces low-frequency rhythms. What is incredibly fascinating here is that neurologically speaking, the low frequencies act as a carrier wave that actually helps disengage the high-frequency noise of your focused attention. It allows the brain to hit reset. The high frequencies are literally riding the lower frequencies, exactly like a surfboard riding on an ocean swell.
Now, what's really interesting here is how Weber ties this whole thing together into the concept of human imagination. He states that alternating phases of concentration and contemplation generate ideas in the exact same way that surfing maneuvers are composed of those alternating phases of penetration and release. Think about that for a second. Our imagination is literally born from negotiating the tension between reason, the board, and perception, the wave. To create, we have to constantly alternate between focusing sharply and just letting go.
Which leads us to part 3, the conclusion, finding stability in the void.
Let's look at why getting this balance right matters so much. Our spatial perspective, that rigid, object-oriented way of looking at the world, evolved for physical self-defense. It's literally how our ancestors spotted predators. But in modern society, our threats aren't usually physical anymore, are they? They're reputational. When a reputation is threatened, our social masks are totally stripped away. And if we're stuck in that hyperspatial, objective mindset, looking at ourselves merely as objects, well, the loss of that mask exposes us to a terrifying existential void. It creates massive, massive anxiety. But here is the ultimate takeaway from Weber's framework. The problem actually isn't the existential void itself. No, the problem is the rigid, objective perspective we use to look at it. As paradoxical as it seems, the fluid present is the only truly stable perspective there is. When we stop trying to freeze the world into static objects and instead embrace the temporal flow, the wave, the void completely stops being terrifying. So, I want to leave you with this final question to chew on. Are you fighting the wave, or are you finding stability in the fluid present? Understanding your brain's dopamine and serotonin balance isn't just about knowing some interesting chemistry facts. It's about learning exactly when to concentrate and drive forward, and when you need to just let go and be carried by the wave of reality. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I genuinely hope this helps you ride your own waves a little more smoothly out there.